All right, let's begin. Working in progress. Let's begin. Good morning, everyone. So we are on Daf Tet Vav. Daf Tet Vav Amud Aleph. So yesterday we spoke about a few things. We got onto a new topic of lav hanitak le'aseh and lav sheketamo le'aseh. Right. This is something that we've seen previously. Well, lav shenitak le'aseh we've seen previously. Again, where you have a prohibition, you have a lav, you have a lo ta'aseh, certainly which carries no other penalty. So the penalty would be Makkot. When would the penalty be Makkot? That is the default, but there are certain exceptions, as we've seen, and we're going to discuss further. If it is a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, a negative prohibition which has no action with it, then there will not be Makkot. If it is a lav shenitak le'aseh, if it is a lav whereby you have a positive mitzvah which comes to correct that negative mitzvah. We've said it many times, I'll say it again. For example, somebody stole, right, which is a lav of not to steal, but then there is a lav shenitak le'aseh because there's an aseh of a shivet hagzela. That is the way that is corrected. So there we said that there's going to be no malkut. We learned on Daf Yud Gimel that the reason why there'll be no malkut for all these things is because they are not similar to the lav of chasima, of muzzling an ox, that is written next to malkut in the Torah. And we learned from there, binyan af, that any lav which is similar to the lav of chasima, I mention it because it's going to come up again in the daf, but any lav which is similar to that would be would similarly get malkut. Anything which is not so, which is dissimilar, like where there is a lav shenitak le'aseh, or like where there is no maaseh, you would not get malkut for that. And then we saw yesterday that there's now a new category which is similar to a lav shenitak le'aseh, but slightly different, and that is a lav shekdamo aseh, right? Where you have the mitzvah aseh that is associated with it, but it comes before, meaning it comes independently. Meaning the lav shenitak le'aseh, the aseh can only be done as a result of performing the lav. Whereas a lav shekdamo aseh, we say even if you didn't do the lav, you could still perform the aseh. So the example we said yesterday, we said the example of the ones. If a person is ones, a woman, and then says the Torah that he has to marry her, again, if she agrees, and he has to marry her and he's not allowed to divorce her. So there's a lav against divorcing her. If he then divorces her, he has to go back and remarry her. That is the aseh. But that aseh of marrying her applied even before he divorced her, even if he didn't divorce her. And that would therefore be a lav shekdamo le'aseh, according to one explanation in the Gemara. So we said yesterday like this. Rabbi Bachana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that for a lav shekdamo aseh you would get malkut, unlike a lav shenitak le'aseh. Yeah, lav shekdamo aseh you would get malkut. And then the Gemara said no. They asked either Rabbi Yochanan or they asked Rabbi Bachana, depending on how we read that line at the top of Daf Tet Vav Amud Aleph. He said no. So then Rabbi came along and said no. Said this is true. Meaning initially Rabbi Yochanan says yes malkut for a lav shekdamo aseh, and then says the Gemara no. He said no, or he went back on himself, said no malkut for a lav shekdamo aseh. So Rabbi said, how can that be? Because we know from our Mishnah. We know from the case, and I'll just say it outside, I won't read through this inside now, but from the case of somebody who is in the Mikdash and becomes Tameh, and then there is an aseh that they need to leave, right? An aseh of loy tamot, an aseh of not coming into of sending them away, of leaving the Mikdash, and there is also a lav of entering the Mikdash in Tumah. But we know that one would get malkut for entering the Mikdash in a state of Tumah. So that seems to be the proof for Rabbi Yochanan's original statement that lav shekdamo aseh one would get malkut. Okay, so that was Rabbi, and then we challenge that. Then we get into the case of ones, which seems to back up the retraction. This is the case which seems to be the kasha to say that no, even though it is a lav shekdamo aseh, there would not be malkut for that. And it's this case which is what we're going to discuss for the next for a great proportion of the summit. So let's just see it again. We're in Daf Tet Vav Amud Aleph. Right, line number 5. Already line number 4. The last two words. It says, meaning what is the reason why Rabbi Yochanan went back? What is the reason Rabbi Yochanan, although he initially said that a lav shek damua you would get Malkot, he then said you won't get Malkot? The reason is Mishum the kasha le ones. It's the kasha from this case of ones. What is the case? Titania. Ones shegilish, right? So again, we're not talking here. Important to just bear in mind, we're not talking about the lo taseh of the ones in the first place. That is relevant to the story, but that's not our focus. There was the ones in the first place. So then there is an aseh to marry her, and now there is a lo taseh to divorce. That's the lo taseh that we're talking about later on. After so ones shegilish, which he was not allowed to do. Im Yisraelu machzir ve'no lokeh. If he's a Yisrael, so then he has to go back and remarry. He has to remarry, and then there would not be Malkot. Im Kohen lokeh ve'no machzir. If he's a Kohen, because the Kohen's not allowed to marry a divorcee, so he can't go back and marry her, so then he would get Malkot. Yes, okay. So again, in all these cases, and actually we're going to see it later on the Amud, where you have a lav shenitak la'aseh, so there is a scenario whereby you could still get malkut for that, where you aren't going to fulfill the aseh. There's a machloket. Does it mean in a case where a person did not do the aseh, or does it mean where the person removed the possibility of being able to do the aseh? This is what the Gemara is going to talk on later on about bitlu or lo bitlu, or kimo or lo kimo. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In any event, if he's a Kohen, so he cannot remarry her and he gets malkut. But if he's Israel, he has to remarry her, and there are no malkut. Now, that seems to contradict what Rabbi Yochanan said initially, right? He says, "Im Yisrael hu machzir ve'no lokeh." Amai lo, amai, right? Amai, why not? Lo taseh shekdamo aseh uvelilki. This is a lo taseh. This is a lav shekdamo aseh. Again, the aseh which came first was to marry her the first time, but it's that lo shachol kol yamav, that he can't. And then the lo taseh came along, not to divorce her. Now he's going back and marrying her again. That's not a lav shenitak la'aseh. That's a lav shekdamo la'aseh, and that seems to be therefore a very strong kasha, which caused Rabbi Yochanan to say no. Actually, in fact, even for a lav shekdamo la'aseh, one would not get malkut. Okay, so says the Gemara now. Amar Ula. And it says, wait, maybe we can learn this slightly differently. He says, Lo yomar lo tiyeh leisha be'ones v'ligamer mimotzi shem. Okay, the question is like this. If you have a look, see Rashi over here, because Rashi quotes the pasuk for us, or if you have the pasuk on the side, the pasuk on the side is referring to the next case. But if you have a look at Rashi that says the kasha le'ones, you'll see there in the third line of that Rashi, it quotes pasuk, it says dichtiv v'lo tiyeh leisha lo yuchal leshalcha. Continues lo yuchal leshalcha kol yamav, meaning she will be a wife. They'll get married. V'lo yuchal leshalcha kol yamav, and you won't be able to divorce her for the rest of his life. So says Ula like this. Maybe this concept of lo tiyeh leisha, which it says by the case of ones, is actually superfluous. It's actually superfluous. It didn't need to teach this in the pasuk. Again, what's our understanding until now? That when the pasuk over here says v'lo tiyeh leisha, it says that he has to marry her. When is it referring to? Referring to after the ones has taken place. There's no mention here of divorce in the pasuk. Okay, so we assume this is before. If he was to transgress and divorce, these words lo tiyeh leisha is referring to before that, and therefore it's a lav shekdamo aseh. The aseh comes first. Again, the lav is the divorce, but the aseh comes first. It's independent of that, of getting married. What Ula is going to try and do, what Ula is trying to prove, is that actually in the pasuk here, where it says lo tiyeh leisha, those words are superfluous, and those words are referring to not getting married to her after the ones has taken place, because we would have known that from somewhere else. It's referring to after he gets divorced. And then he goes back and says, if he divorces, although we'll have to see how he learns it out. But he says, if he divorces her, then he has to go back and remarry her. V'lo tiyeh leisha. And if that's the case, that the pasuk here is referring to marrying her after the divorce, that is not coming before the lo taseh. That is coming after the lo taseh. That is then a lav shenitak la'aseh. And therefore, I understand why there would be malkut for it, why there wouldn't be malkut for it. And that could therefore be a teretz for Rabbi Yochanan. The problem is, if we learn it that way, if we learn, again, I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because we haven't yet seen the explanation in the Gemara, but if we learn the way Ula wants to say, then maybe this case is also a lav shenitak la'aseh. So then we could say, well, lav shekdamo aseh, one would still get Makkot for. But what is the example of a lav shekdamo aseh? We're going to be stuck because we don't actually have any other examples of that. So what's the nafkamina? That in itself is a question. Maybe what Rabbi Yochanan is teaching us here is the definition of a lav shenitak la'aseh. But so let's break it down. Let's see how Ula learns it. So again, he says, Amar Ula, lo yomar or lo yamer lo tia leisha be'ones. It didn't need to say, in this case of ones, it did not need to say these words. It didn't need to say lo tia leisha. Why? And because you could have learned it out from ligamer mi motzi shemra, from a different case, the case of a motzi shemra. So again, there are a number of these cases, these interesting and somewhat strange cases in the Torah. The ones is one we've discussed. The motzi shemra is another one, whereby a person gets married and to a Arab Betula, and then he claims that in fact she was not a Betula when they got married. He goes to Beit Din and he tells them this has implications in terms of the Ketubah, has implications in terms of mandatory law, and turns out that he was actually lying. He came along and he said that she was not a Betula, but she was. So he would then be required to pay a knas, to pay a fine, and similarly, there it's a case where they're already married, so it's going to be different. But there also he would not be allowed to divorce. So there you have, by the Motzi Shemra, you have a similar pasuk. Have a look on the side. You'll see it's Varim Kafbet Yutet. It says Vanshu oto mea kesef v'nanu la'avia ne'ara ki yotzi Shemra b'tulat Yisrael. In that case, he has to pay a knas of 100 coins of silver, which he has to pay her father because she's a ne'ara. And it says, "V'lo tiyeh leisha lo yochal leshalcha kol yamav." Those words should sound familiar because it's the same wording in that pasuk regarding the motzi shemra as it is regarding the ones. So he says, we could have learned already from the fact that it says lo tiyeh leisha by this other case, by this case of motzi shemra, we can extrapolate that applies as well to the case of ones. Right, and therefore, so says Ula like this: Lo yamer lo tia leisha be'ones v'ligamer motzi shemra. Why would you learn it from motzi shemra? Why would you think it applies from that case? It applies to our case as well. Right. So. Yeah, again, so lo tia leisha be'ones v'ligamer motzi shemra. Uma motzi shemra shelo asa maaseh amar rachmana v'lo tia leisha ones lo kol sheken. Says you would learn out essentially from a kal v'chomer. You would say if the motzi shemra there is no maaseh, and again this is we discussed this earlier on. I will discuss again that motzi shemra. What has a person done? All they've done is they've gone and they've spoken. That is not a maaseh. That is not an action, right? To what extent is dibur considered like maaseh for these matters? We discussed this in the first Perek, you'll remember, when we spoke about Eidim Zomimim. And we said, and we asked a question about whether right at the beginning of the Masechet, whether Eidim Zomimim is considered would one get Makkot? Is Eidim Zomimim considered lav she'ein bo ma'aseh? Because you're just speaking. We actually had a comparison there with Motzi Shemra. Maybe we'll see it again in a moment. But so just as the Motzi Shemra, there is no action. And the Torah said, nonetheless, because of what you've done, lo tiyeh leisha kol yamav, you're not allowed to divorce her. So by ones, all the more so, where there is an action which is done, and therefore he has to. This would apply as well, right? Ma motzi shemra shelo asa maaseh amar rachmana v'lo tiyeh leisha ones lo kol sheken. And therefore, we understand that if we the idea, the concept of lo tiyeh leisha v'lo shalcha kol yamav applies, we already know it from a kal v'chomer, from Motzi Shemra. Why then is it written in this pasuk? Why does it state it regarding ones? Answers the Gemara, no inyan lefanav, no inyan lacharav. If it's not, we've seen this before. It's similar to the midot, whereby sometimes you have something which is written in one place and it's not relevant to that case, so it must be relevant to something else. Right? We learned this a few days ago, where we saw the extra karet right, written by the Arayot, and we said it doesn't come to teach us anything else. It comes to distinguish for karet, for separate chiyuvim, for mefatem and sach. All right, it's eno inyan lakad, no inyan lasham. That was one way. So a slight variation on that form of limud, on that form of extrapolation is the following. And what was it? Meaning it's not to teach you about beforehand, but it's to teach you about after. I.e., we thought that it said when it said velot Elisha is talking about before divorce. Maybe there's a case where he does not divorce her, but it's just after the honest that he has to marry her and he has to stay married to her. Now we're saying, no, we already know that from a kal v'chomer. So therefore, what is it actually teaching? It's teaching you that if he does divorce her, then there's a separate assay that he has to go back and he has to remarry her again. And therefore, it becomes a lav shenitak la'aseh. She'im giresh yachzir, that if he divorced her, he has to remarry. Okay, so I just want to have a look at Rashi. We'll come back to the Gemara in a moment, because the Gemara is now going to question. It's going to say, is it really so simple? Is it really so clear that you can make a kal v'chomer from the case of motzi shemra to the case of ones? Meaning, yes, we know that by motzi shemra there's no ma'aseh, and by ones there is a ma'aseh, but there are going to be other differences, and we'll see that in a moment. So have a look just at Rashi. Let's go back to Rashi where he says Im Yisrael Hu, just talking about originally this case. He says Im Yisrael Hu. This is about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6, 7 lines down from the narrow lines in Rashi. He says She'achol lekayem ma'aseh v'yachzirena machzir v'eno lokeh. Right? If he's a Yisrael and he divorces the woman, then he can fulfill the aseh by remarrying her, and he doesn't get Makkot. But if he's a Kohen, im Kohenu, she'asur b'glusha, where he's forbidden, right? This would be, somebody asked yesterday about mitzvah haba ba'aveira, right? So this would be a case. The Kohen cannot, it would be, you say it's a mitzvah for him to marry her, but it would be an aveira for him to marry her. He's not allowed to do that. He's not allowed to marry a divorcee in the first place. And therefore that would not be, we say mitzvah haba ba'aveira, one may not perform. So im Kohenu she'asur b'glusha, Lokev eino machzir. Then he would get Makkot and he would not remarry. Vamai. So we ask a question. This was the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Im Yisrael hu machzir ve'eino lokeh. Right. If he's Yisrael, so he remarries her and he does not get Makkot. Im itza lid Rabbi Yochanan. If it's true what Rabbi Yochanan originally said, that I love shekdamo aseh, one would get Makkot for. Right, the chiddush was even if they fulfill the aseh, so halot aseh shekdamo aseh. This is a lot aseh which was preceded by an aseh, and therefore there should be Makkot. And so that was the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. So then came Ula, and he said, no, Amar Ula, hi lav shenitak le'aseh. Says Ula, this is not a lav shekdamo aseh. This is a lav shenitak le'aseh. The ilav lentuk elave atahai aseh. Lo hava misrach lemichtave, right? It's like if this was if it was not the lavran took a lave, if it was not a lav which was to this connected to this assay, so then it would not need to write this. The ilitzchilato velomar shisaena. If it was just talking about originally, meaning if they had not gotten divorced, just to say he needs to marry her in the first place. Lo yomar lo tiyeh leisha. It doesn't need to say lo tiyeh leisha in this pasuk. V'nigmar mimotzi shemra. We can learn it out, as we've explained, as a kal v'chomer from motzi shemra. Dichtiv beinami v'lo tiyeh leisha lo yochal l'shokha. Because over there in the pasuk it says the exact same thing. It says the exact same words. Right. So that was Ula's. That is the first stage. Ula is saying that since it's this idea of lo tiyeh leisha lo yochal l'shokha kol yamav is written, the same thing is written by the ones. And it's written by the Motzi Shemra. Just as we would have said, just as we know that by the Motzi Shemra, this is the case, and there it is a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, because he did no action. So to over here, all the more so where he did an action, meaning because he was ma'anes in the first place. Therefore, the same thing would apply. So why does the pasuk write it again? It must write it again to teach us about the case where he divorced her, where he wasn't allowed to. And this is going to be now a lav shenitak le'aseh. Right, continues Rashi, imeino inyan lifnei gerushin. It's not coming to teach us about before the divorce. Learn it out as teaching us after the divorce. To say that if he had divorced her, he should remarry, and she should once again be his wife, and therefore through that he will be exempt from the love. It's a love shenitak las. Okay. Now says the Gemara as follows. It says, it says, but wait a minute. Nonetheless, ones mimotzi shemra lo gamar. Says you wanted to learn a kal v'chomer. You wanted to learn a kal v'chomer of ones from the motzi shemra, and you said that just as the motzi shemra, there is no action that he did. It was just speech. So yeah, there's actions, all the more so. However, says the Gemara, you can refute this kal v'chomer, because the kal v'chomer only works if one case is really more stringent than the other. But if the original case has got other stringencies, which the second case does not have, then it won't work. It says the kalamifrach ma lemotzi shemra sheken loke u'mishalem. Right, that's the question. How can you learn from motzi shemra? Why? Because motzi shemra has got its own. It's got its own stringency. It's got its own chum, which is this is a case whereby one gets both. One would get Makkot, and they would have to pay a knas. Normally, we've seen in the last few dapim as well. Normally, we would only have one punishment. Yeah, there's a special stringency. The Torah says you get two punishments. Now, if this sounds a little bit familiar, and it should sound a little bit familiar, it's because many months ago, we saw a similar limud at the beginning of the Masechet. Go back to Daf Daled for a moment. Daf Daled Amud Bet. And this was the sugya where we were discussing regarding Eidim Zomamim, regarding the sugya of Lav She'ein Bo Maaseh. Right, and the Gemara wanted to learn. The Gemara was suggesting that maybe where would we learn the fact that Lav She'ein Bo Maaseh would be exempt from Makkot? One of the places we suggested to learn it from was from the case of Motzi Shemra. Right, have a look on Daf Daled Amud Bet, about halfway down the page. So it says, Miklad Rabbi Yehuda Savar Lav She'ein Bo Maaseh Lo Kin Alav. So in other words, there was an opinion that said that a lav she'ein bo maaseh you would get Makkot. So where did you learn that from? So Amar Ula Gamami Motzi Shemra says he learned it from the case of Motzi Shemra. That's what we're discussing now. Ma Motzi Shemra lav she'ein bo maaseh lo kin alav. Motzi Shemra, there is no maaseh, as we've said, because it's just speech. But nonetheless, you would get Makkot. Of course, lav she'ein bo maaseh lo kin alav. So to any lav where there is no maaseh, you would get Makkot. You learn that as a binyan av. And then over there, we said the same thing. We said, no. You can't learn from here to everywhere else because there's a chiddush. It says ma lemotzi shemra. Excuse me. So we're just looking back on Daf Daled Amud Bet. If you've got a loss, we'll be back to our daf in just a few moments. But it says over there, it says ma motzi shemra lav she'ein bo maaseh lo kin alav. Of course, lav she'ein bo maaseh lo kin alav. So ma motzi shemra sheken loker mishalem. So how can you learn out from motzi shemra? Because that has a chiddush. There you are loker and mishalem, which is highly unusual that you do both. So there were those who wanted to say you learn from Eidim Zomamim, but Eidim Zomamim also has its own chumrah, which is that Eidim Zomamim don't have hatra'ah. They don't have warning, which is also highly unusual. So then the Gemara said, no, you learn from both of them together, right? From both of those cases. That was the discussion over there on Daf Daled. But the point is, we see again this idea that Motzi Shemra has a special chumrah, and therefore we can't necessarily extrapolate from it. So back on our daf, back on Daf Tetvav Amud Aleph. So we said, so Ula wanted to say that the case of Ones is a lav shenitak le'aseh, because the aseh that's written lo tieh leisha, right, is teaching us specifically after divorce, because from before divorce we already know from a kal v'chomer from the case of Motzi Shemra. But now we're saying no, because the case of Motzi Shemra, you can't learn from that, because there you are lokeh u'mishalem, right? So ma Motzi Shemra sheken lokeh u'mishalem. So now we're about halfway down on the Amud. So we refine it. So we say slightly differently. Ella lo yamer lo tiye leisha b'motzi she'emra v'legamer me'ones. So now it says, let's do it. Let's learn it the other way around. Not to say, right, because this pasuk of lo tiye leisha, it's written twice. It's written exactly the same way. Don't learn that by ones it's superfluous because you could learn it from motzi she'emra. Learn that by motzi she'emra it's superfluous, and you should have learned that from ones. How so? אלא לא יאמר לא תהיה לאישה במוציא שאמרה ולגמרי מאונס. ומה אונס שאינו לוקח ומשלם, אמר רחמנא ולא תהיה לאישה, מוציא שאמרה לא כל שכן. We're using the chumrah of motzi she'emra this time around to learn the other direction. Say, just as in the case of ones, right, you would not have Makkot and pay, and nonetheless there it says lo tiye leisha. So kavachomer motzi she'emra, where it says you be lokeh and meshalem, you would get both. So this lo tiye leisha would also apply. And then we can say, now we've freed up the pasuk, so to speak, for a different drasha. So now we can say lama ne'emar. Why then does it say lo tiye leisha by the case of motzi she'emra? Lama ne'emar imay no inyan lamotzi she'emra no inyan lo ones. If it's not coming to teach you anything about the motzi she'emra, because you already know, right? So then it must be coming to teach you the case regarding honest. As we said before. Okay, but now you're probably one step ahead, and you're probably already thinking this. Says the Gemara, motzi she'emra me honest nami lo gamar. No. You cannot, and just as we said before, that you cannot learn it from. You cannot learn honest from motzi she'emra. You can't learn motzi she'emra from honest. Why? What's the perek of this kavachomer? Right? The ikal mifrach ma leones sheken asa maaseh. Right? Meaning it's the same two things. It's just going in the opposite direction. Initially we wanted to say like this. We said we want to learn the kavachomer from motzi she'emra to honest. We said just as motzi she'emra there is no maaseh, so you can learn by honest, all the more so because there is a maaseh. So then we said no, you can't learn from that because motzi she'emra has got a chumrah. The chumrah is that it's lokeh and he pays as well. So we said okay, fine, let's learn it the other way. Let's say just like honest, he's not lokeh u'mishalem, learn kavachomer to motzi she'emra as well. And we say no, but motzi she'emra has got the honest has got the stringency that there's a maaseh, and by motzi she'emra there's not. So that falls away as well. Right? Ella. So now we try a third approach. We say like this. Ella lo yamer lo tiye leisha b'motzi she'emra sheharei ishtohi. Okay, so regarding the case of motzi she'emra, there's another difference, which is that they're already married. Right? In the case of ones, what are we saying? That the person has gone and he's committed this action. Now he has to go, and the Torah tells us he has to go and he has to marry the woman again if she agrees. And her father agrees. But he has to go and marry her, and then he's not allowed to get divorced. Over here by motzi she'emra, it's not that he has to go and marry. They already are married. That's the case of motzi she'emra, and then he can't divorce her. So why does it say lo tiye leisha? Meaning she already is ishto, right? So lo yamer lo tiye leisha b'motzi she'emra sherei ishtoi. Doesn't have to say she's going to be his wife. She already is his wife. Lama ne'emar. So why does it say it? Imeino inyan lamotzi she'emra neu inyan laones. So if it's not necessary to say it for this case, motzi she'emra, learn it for the case of ones. In other words, what we're saying now is slightly different to what we said before. We're trying to learn it from a kavachomer. Here you're just learning it more sort of a straight drash from the fact that it's superfluous in this case. So imeino inyan lamotzi she'emra neu inyan laones. V'meino inyan lefanav neu inyan la'acharav. Right, and that's essentially what we said before. So let's just see Rashi. What we said beforehand. So we said imeino inyan. I think we saw this said vakati. So this was the first kavachomer, and this was the first percha. We say it was necessary to write it. And it was it was necessary. It's talking about lefanav, meaning before divorce, talking about the fact that the ones has to marry her in the first place. Because if it had not been written by the case of ones, says Rashi, ones mimotzi shemra lo gamar, we would not have been able to learn it. The ana amina, we would have said, ma lemotzi shemra dinu shiknesu lekansa sheken loke u'mishalem b'tchilato. You would have said that just by the case of motzi shemra, therefore there is and essentially what you see over here as well. Rashi says dinu sheyiknesu lekansa, that the fact that he has to marry her, that they have to get married, is a knas. All right. What is the nafkamina, by the way, of the fact if we define the fact they have to get married as a knas? Knas, we know, is a separate halachic category of dinei mamonot. We discussed this in the first Perek. It has its own laws, has its own rules. First of all, in terms of extrapolation. Also, a knas can only be imposed by a beit din samuch, which we don't have nowadays, right? Only when you have a beit din samuch. So different halachot regarding knas nowadays would not be practically applicable. But that's the side point. So Rashi says over here, so he says we would have expected that by the Motzi Shemra there is the knas they have to get married, because we know he already gets Makkot and he has to pay. So we'll get this knas as well. However, we would have said that by ones we don't impose the extra knas, so to speak, and therefore we would not have been able to learn it. And so it says, Ma ones, continues Rashi, Ma ones she'enor, okay? B'tchilato, amar Rachmana, lo tiyeh leisha, motzi shemra lo kol sheken. Right, so that's already the next section that Rashi is saying. That's once we refute the Kal Vachomer, we try to learn in the other way around. We say just as the ones who does not get Malkot at the beginning, but the Motzi Shemra did, right? So we would have thought that we could learn it from there, and ultimately we rejected that also. Rashi just points out that he said there, where we wanted to say that the pasuk of Lo Tiyeh Leisha was written by Motzi Shemra, and we said it's not relevant for Motzi Shemra, but say it for ones. But even though we're moving from one pasuk to the other, we've got that one limud. We've also got the limud of Im Eino Inyan Lefanav. Shrei Batzmo Katuvken, and it already said Lo Tiyeh Leisha regarding ones, and therefore you learn it Tneu Inyan La'acharav. Okay, and then we said no. So we rejected the Kal Vachomer in both directions, and we said ultimately from the fact that it says Lo Tiyeh Leisha by Motzi Shemra, but why does it say Lo Tiyeh Leisha? Because she already is Ishto, Sharei Ishtohu. So says Rashi, Kvar Kichav Nisa, they already are married. Okay, so that was it. That was what we said. That's where we're up to. So again, says the Gemara. Ela lo yamer lo tiyeh leisha b'motzi shemra sharei ishtohi. Right, about 6 or 7 lines up from the wide lines, it says why does it say lo tiyeh leisha by the motzi shemra? They already are married. So lama nemar imay no inyan lemotzi shemra no inyan lo ones. It's not relevant for this case. It must be teaching about the case of ones. V'imay no inyan lefanav. And if it's not, you don't need it for the case of ones beforehand, before divorce, because it already says the pasuk there. So therefore, it's teaching over the case of after divorce. It's making it a lav shenitak le'aseh. So now, says the Gemara, hang on, we could question that. Ve'ema, why don't you say the following? You said that it was irrelevant for the case of Motzi Shemra because they already are married. But what if he divorced her there? Right? You said you wanted to use this was extra case of Lo Tiyeh Leisha in a case of ones. If he divorced her, he has to remarry her. Well, isn't it more simple to say that it's talking about the case in the pasuk in question, right? Ve'ema imeino inyan lefanav de motzi shemra tneu inyan la'acharav didei. Right? Why don't we just say it's irrelevant for the current case where he hasn't divorced her because he's already married, but say that it's coming to teach you about afterwards that in the case of Motzi Shemra, if he divorces her, that he would then have to go and remarry her. Right? Of that case, the lo laki, that they would not get, that you would then not get Malkut. So says the Gemara, you're correct. You could learn it out that way, and you do learn it out for that case. But then we say, Va'ati ones v'gamar mine. Right. So, in other words, in the case of Motzi Shemra, where it says "Velot yelo leisha," even though they're already married, we learn that means yes, they're already married. But if they get divorced, then he needs to remarry her. That is the limud in the pasuk. Now, by that limud, we learn from Motzi Shemra, we learn it across to the ones as well. Right. We'll now extrapolate that to this case. So it says the Gemara, but I don't understand. How can you? Right, what method of extrapolation? How can you learn it across? Right, we're saying go va'ati ones v'gamar mine. How are you learning it? So you say iba kal v'chomer, iba ma matzinu. Right, two possibilities here. You might learn how to say kal v'chomer. You say if this is the din which applies by the case of Motzi Shemra, you would learn it for the case of ones as well, all the more. So we've already discussed different possibilities for kal v'chomer, and we've refuted them. Or you could say b'meh matzinu, which is another type of limud, right? One of the essentially a binyan av. This is not a kal v'chomer, but this is a you say the Torah taught us in one place, and that is sort of teaching you for the entire category, where you can extrapolate to other cases as well. But it says whether you try and say this is a kal v'chomer, or whether you say this is a binyan av, it's a ikar mifrach. We know already that you can refute it. You can refute it. Why? Because about 10 minutes ago we saw that on this daf. It says Mala Motzi Shemra Sheken Lo Asa Maaseh. By the case of Motzi Shemra, there is no Maaseh. It's only Dibur, and therefore either it's not the same kind of category, or there is no kal v'chomer. So how do we learn from Motzi Shemra to the case of ones? Ela marava kol yamav ba'amod vehechzer. So says Rava. This is what it means to say that in the pasuk regarding ones teaches us that this there is this constant mitzvah that he has to go back and he has to marry her. Says Rashi, Ela amarava. The reason why we learned that in the case of ones, he would have to remarry, and there would not be malkot for this. You have to say that it is in fact a lav shenitak laseh. Damakra kol yamav. From the fact that it says, essentially now we're saying the limit is from the fact that it says kol yamav. The fact that it says lo tia leisha lo tuchal l'shalchena kol yamav, his entire life, right? Those extra words. Lo avalei lemichtav ela lo yuchal l'shalcha. What would you not have understood if it had just said he cannot divorce her? Why does it say he cannot divorce her his entire life? It's a my kol yamav. So what is that coming to add? Hachi kamar, says Rashi. This is what it means to say. Rashi lost of the narrow lines. Hachi kamar lo tahei b'shiluchea kol yamav ela yachzirena, meaning that she cannot. He's not allowed to divorce. So he's not allowed to leave her divorce for his entire life. He has to go back and remarry her. In other words, there's a sort of a continuous mitzvah here. This is what it means to say. Meaning that she should be his that she should be his wife, Ishmael, if he divorced her. If he divorced her, that cannot be l'chol yamav, that cannot be permanent. In other words, what Rav is saying is that we learn out at the end of the day, we learn out this mitzvah asay, not from the case of Motzi Shemra. That's what Ula was suggesting initially, because we've rejected that. We learn out from the pasuk itself. But we learn that from the pasuk itself, it's referring to, it's also referring to the initial mitzvah, the initial asay of marrying her. But from the fact that it says, Lo tuchal l'shalcha Kol Yamav, as he just said, there's a specific assay which is dependent on if he divorces her, he cannot leave her divorced. If he divorces her, he has to get remarried, and therefore, we consider this to be not a lav shekdamo assay, which, as I say, may or may not. The conclusion of this is that there may or may not be such a case that is actually considered a lav shekdamo assay, but this is considered a lav shenitakle assay, and therefore that is the reason why there would not be Makkot for it. Okay. Ad kan.
Sure. Thank you very much. Very good, Shiur.